Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Fallout from the Uhlmann verdict continues to cause shockwaves. Now, much of the focus has rightly been on the finding of sexual assault on the balance of probabilities. But tonight, that other finding, where there was no Liberal cover-up of the allegations, which means Labor now must come clean about everything they knew and how involved they were, and using this to try and bring down the Morrison government. And key in all of this is that multi-million-dollar payout to Brittany Higgins. Tonight on the show, my new Credlin regular, former Press Gallery veteran Chris Uhlmann. Now, you'll know him. He's got a long history. He's someone who's long called out China and has plenty of observations to make about whether our society is fraying at the edges as the government fails to do what's needed to manage the divisions out of the Middle East here in Australia. Plus, on that point, Israel looks set to retaliate against Iran's barrage of missile and drone strikes. Western allies are still urging Israel to show restraint, but says it will not be stopped from defending itself. And Sydney left reeling once more after an alleged attack last night on a high-profile Christian bishop. An incident now officially declared by police as a terror attack. There's a lot to get across tonight. New background on the attacker, and this attempt at false moral equivalence today from so-called leaders, with the audio of the translated Arabic allegedly spoken by the attacker that suggests a religious motivation behind the knife assault. But first, with the knifing of a bishop in full view of his congregation, live streamed around the world, and with the subsequent rowdy scenes outside the church captured by news crews, and with all the social media sharing that happens these days as a matter of course, the fractures in Australian society are now graphically on display. The assailant is apparently a 16-year-old Muslim who has allegedly said that he'd repeatedly stabbed the bishop for attacking the prophet. If that's accurate, then that's presumably a reference to Muhammad.
منو دزك هنا؟ بس ليش عم بيسب رسولي ما كنت جيت لهون؟ إذا عم بيدخل حلب ديني ما كنت جيت لهون، بس هو عم يدخل حلب ديني. هي دين إذا هو حكى هي دين الشيطان مالتك حبيبي، روح على شيطانك شوف شو يسوي عليك. إذا هو بس حكى عن دينه ما كنت جيت.
Presumably, it was those alleged words that prompted New South Wales Police to formally declare the event a terror incident. And it's now with ASIO, our National Domestic Intelligence Agency, to consider whether this was a religiously motivated terror attack. But I think you'll all probably have drawn your own conclusions. Now, the first thing to be said here is that Bishop Marmari Emmanuel has been forthright, even contentious, but he's never called for a holy war against anyone. In fact, quite the opposite. Here he is in a recent sermon describing a visit inside Gaza, where he demanded to get off the bus and speak with local Palestinians against understandable security advice.
The bus driver, Bishop, get in the bus. I said, go, brother. I'm not moving. Let them chop me. What are they going to do? I don't care. I'm staying here. They came in a blink of an eye running. I'm literally running fast like a gazelle. They surrounded the whole bus and me in the hundreds. And they started saying, nobody asks about us. Nobody cares about us. Nobody knows how we live. We are struggling here. Please, please. Help us. I went into the bus, collected some money, gave whatever we could give, and then they started saying, God bless you, God be with you. Thank you so much for coming and visiting us. Please tell everyone the way we live in here. We are starving to death. And they were. There is a lot of Palestinians got nothing to do with what is happening there. They just want to live in peace. And I'm sure on the Israeli side as well. I'm sure. Because I've met Jewish people, absolutely beautiful. Very respectful. Beautiful people. Absolutely beautiful. From both sides, absolutely beautiful.
Now contrast those words from his recent visit to Gaza with sermons from Islamist preachers in Australia.
صفة من صفات اليهود هي أنهم شعب متعطش لسفك الدماء، شعب يحب سفك الدم.
The trees will speak, the stone will speak, and they'll say, "O Muslim, O believer, there is a Yahudi behind me, come and kill him."
Jihad is part of our deen and one of the highest pillars of our deen. Hamas is mujahideen and freedom fighters and warriors.
Within moments of the attack on Bishop Emmanuel, in part because it occurred live on camera, which I suspect was precisely what the attacker intended, an angry mob was outside the bishop's church trying to get their hands on his assailant. Now, in the end, some 30 people, say reports, needed medical attention, some hurt trying to subdue the attacker, and quite a few more in the subsequent scuffles outside the church. Which brings me to what else must be said. There can't be different standards for different groups in our society. Here's the New South Wales Police Commissioner telling last night's rioters that they'll be identified and punished.
This is unacceptable. Police attended the incident in Wakeley last night to assist that community in response to calls for assistance, and the crowd turned on police. That is unacceptable, and those that were involved in that riot can expect a knock at the door.
Fair enough, because the last thing we need is a faith-based lynch mob. But where was the police commissioner's condemnation of the pro-Hamas mob outside the Opera House on October 9, screaming what I heard as "gas the Jews, get the Jews"? Where was her comments then saying she would identify and punish anyone celebrating the slaughter of 1,200 innocent Israeli citizens? Yeah, where are all the arrests from then, Commissioner? Today, New South Wales Premier Chris Minns said that we are a society on edge. And he's right. But part of that is the failure of people in authority, in the Albanese government especially, from the Prime Minister down, to call out evil when it's staring us in the face. There is no moral equivalent, none, between the deliberate slaughter of women, children, even babies, and civilian deaths in the course of a just war. And free speech, that shouldn't protect what are incitements to violence like this.
To the invading Jews we say, by Allah, the day you will be kicked out of Palestine is coming. A day when the stones and the trees will speak and say, "O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him."
I mean, are you surprised? The young teenager might get so radicalised watching bile like that on a laptop at home that he allegedly gets a knife and tries to do exactly what the religious imams urge him to do in the name of Islam. Now, maybe that's not what happened here, but I've had the security briefings in the past. I have read the reports of kids turned into killers by Islamic State and others, and my strong sense, because of the way the federal government has mishandled the conflict in Gaza within the Australian community, is that we sit on a tinderbox at this time. And there are some things that the states have responsibility for and some the Commonwealth. The internet, well, it sits squarely in the responsibility of the Commonwealth. And what staggers me is that if the government can order big tech to take down posts about vaccinations or debate about what really is a woman, then it can absolutely order all of this anti-Semitic hate speech off social media in this country. A government with guts could pull down every one of those hate-preaching sermons, get them off the internet and away from vulnerable mixed-up kids if they wanted to. Don't hold your breath, because this is a Labor government that's against some tribes but not others. Today, Labor MP Peter Khalil pleaded with the Assyrian community to let this go.
Even talking to the Assyrian community, you hear people out the front there saying eye for an eye, but, have a think to that congregation. What would the bishop ask you to do? It would be to turn the other cheek and forgive.
Funny, I don't recall that sort of plea to the Palestinian mobs that have demanded the destruction of Israel from the river to the sea for months. Now, already it seems there's more official concern about the angry crowd outside than about the would-be terrorist murderer inside. Like the PM warning today against vigilantism.
People should not take the law into their own hands, but should allow our police and our security agencies to do their job.
I agree no one should take the law into their hands, but it's these official double standards that people are reacting against, even if last night some of them did do the wrong thing. Now, I have zero tolerance for any suggestion of moral equivalence between upset and angry parishioners over an attempt on the life of their much-loved bishop and the person now being investigated for an attack of terrorism. No bloody equivalence at all. It has been a pretty hectic day. Let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Cam Redden.
Good evening. Australia's security leaders are treating the knife attack inside a southwest Sydney church as a religiously motivated terror incident.
There is no place for violence in our community. There is no place for violent extremism.
The Prime Minister convening an early morning meeting of the National Security Committee.
I support New South Wales Police in calling this a terrorist incident, and we believe it is religiously motivated.
It's a volatile period, and you can understand the anxiety that Australians will be feeling.
Iran's embassy in Australia has issued an extraordinary warning to Israel following the weekend's Iranian missile strikes. The statement, obtained exclusively by Sky News, comes a day after Iran's ambassador was hauled before the Department of Foreign Affairs, where officials demanded an end to attacks on Israel. The embassy warns, should the rogue Israeli regime commit another wrongdoing, Iran's next steps will be more crushing and will give another unforgettable lesson to this heinous regime. Sky News has contacted the Foreign Minister's office for a response. Supermarket bosses have rejected accusations of price gouging during a combative Senate committee hearing.
I'm not interested in your spin or your bullshit. This is a Senate inquiry. Answer the question.
Senator, I said before you very respectfully saying we measure ourselves return on investment. Very respectfully
not answering the question.
Woolworths boss Brad Banducci defending his company's $1.7 billion net profit for the last financial year.
Why won't you confirm what your ROE was?
We focus on our return on investment.
All right, it is open to the Senate to hold you in contempt, and that carries potential sanctions, including up to 6 months imprisonment for you.
The Woolies chief making a fast exit. He'll leave his role for good in September. Another big day of news, isn't it? Here to sort it all out, I'm joined by Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. We'll start with a second Sydney stabbing, I'm afraid to say, the second in 3 days, Andrew. 16-year-old allegedly stabbed Bishop Mari Emmanuel and another clergyman during a mass at the Christ the Good Shepherd Church in Western Sydney. This is in the suburb of Wakeley. The whole thing live streamed on the internet. Officially, it's now been declared a terror attack. What do we know about the individual, Andrew, who tried to kill the bishop?
Well, we know he's a youth who, like in regard to the Saturday attack, seemed to have a fascination with knives, Peter. It's a concern, this knife crime issue that we've seen the last couple of days, this one being a terror-related one, quite obviously. But we revealed today that in 2020, when this youth was only 12, he was found to have a knife at school and suspended. And there's been a report today as well that only last year he was put on a good behaviour bond for again being found by police in a public place with a knife. Now, the New South Wales government increased penalties from 2 years to 4 years for having a knife in a school or a public place just last year, but that's a maximum penalty and the courts don't have to take it in mind, and obviously he got off light last time he had a knife. So some real concerns around that. I guess the other thing that we sense from the discussions from law enforcement authorities and the Prime Minister today is it's a lone wolf actor. And often, as I heard you earlier, it's this radicalisation online that is affecting young people and has always, over the last decade, including the time you were in office, been a concern for law enforcement in terms of a whole bunch of lone wolf actors based on being radicalised online. And the other thing I can tell you is this youth went to a school in southwestern Sydney. The lawyers have asked me not to name the school because we can't identify someone who's a youth criminal, or alleged youth criminal, but it is a school which has been the subject of controversy before in terms of radicalisation. So that is the picture I can paint for you. But I really think there is a bit of a marriage too between mental illness difficulties and the ability to be radicalised, and obviously a fascination with knives as well. It's a potentially lethal mix. And we were pretty lucky last night it wasn't even worse. But, I mean, the city's in shock. There's no doubt about it. To have two of these things in 3 days, it's just crazy. And it spurns concerns about more such copycat actions, frankly.
That's the worry. That's the worry. I've got a terrorism expert a little later in the show. There are some interesting characteristics about young people and how quickly they can be radicalised online. I'll get to that in a moment. But I noted with interest today, the PM made mention in that press conference today that he had convened the National Security Committee of Cabinet this morning. Have a listen.
Last night, the New South Wales Police overnight declared this a terror incident. As a result of that declaration, a joint counter-terrorism task force has been established, and this morning we have had a meeting of the National Security Committee to receive formal briefings following informal briefings that occurred earlier this morning.
Now, Andrew, I make the point, in the past we had that Chinese sonar incident, even the issue of October 7 back last year. The Prime Minister has always refused to confirm whether or not he holds these NSC meetings, but pretty quick to say he did today, which says to me he's under pressure.
Well, he's had to give up that policy, hasn't he? And, I mean, it's a situation where, as Prime Minister, you have to outline... I know. I mean, it's hardly a state secret that you hold a meeting. If you start talking about what happened in the meeting, perhaps a different story. But, you know, it's just something that you should be able to answer yes or no, just as you might around a cabinet meeting. But, I mean, you look at that. He has to spell out everything he's doing, show the public what he's doing in relation to an alleged terror incident. So you don't have much of a choice, do you?
And look, people like me on the outside now who have been on the inside, I am tracking everything I think he should be doing against what I know we did with the Lint Cafe terror attack back in 2014. I mean, this is where I think he's under a lot of pressure and scrutiny, as he should be. And I think he's also got to come clean and reverse that.
It's not a bad comparison.
They're very similar.
Because apart from the fact people were killed with gunshots, but it's that same phenomenon of a lone, potentially crazy actor, which is horrific. Yep. Don't get me wrong, but I guess it's preferable to something being organised by a cell or something of that nature. So there's no comfort in this, but if there's any, it's that.
I would say we're 24 hours on, not even that now, Andrew, and it will be interesting to see what comes out of the online community this young person may well be connected with. So he may well have been allegedly the lone actor in last night's events, but are others known to authorities involved in some way that we still don't know?
What was
clearly
he doing
the PM's got to reverse that muddle. Well, the muddle-headed decision of the Prime Minister to throw out of the NSC on a regular basis, at the very least, the ASIO chief, our foreign spy chief, the head of ASIS, they're going to be back in the room permanently, surely.
Well, often there's definitely a need for ASIO. I mean, I don't know if in this instance you necessarily need ASIS, but ASIO, absolutely, you'd think they'd want to be across most things. I think privately the bureaucrats are happy they don't have to sit through every single meeting. But, yeah, I mean, they're extremely important officials in most matters that committee considers.
Yeah, OK. All right, we'll leave it there. Andrew Clennell, great to have you as always. All right, let's go to a bit of a barometer of Sydney, if I can call it that. It's been a shocking few days for all Australians, but I tell you, if you live in Sydney, it's been particularly tough. We've seen, of course, 6 innocents killed on Saturday in the Bondi stabbing, including, serious injuries to a 9-month-old baby. That investigation was really just getting underway. We had that second attack in the Western Sydney church last night. Now, fortunately, in that case, the injuries sustained by the bishop and the parishioner, I can report, are no longer life-threatening. But to get a sense of what this is doing to the fabric of Sydney, let's bring in now the Editor-in-Chief of the Daily Telegraph, Ben English. Ben, as I said, your paper is a barometer of Sydney. So I want to ask you, as the Editor-in-Chief, how's the city's mood after a shocking couple of days?
Oh, it's numbed, it's in shock, it's angry as well. I can tell you, you can't run into anyone or ring anyone in this city without this being brought up first and people just sharing their exasperation, their frustration and their horror and their grief. I mean, I live in the eastern suburbs myself. My daughters go to Bondi Junction, Westfield, every second day. My younger daughter would have been there, but she was working on that particular day and her friends were there. And so this is, obviously I'm not, we're not experiencing anything like, it's just unimaginable what some of the people directly affected are going through at the moment. But it's just to illustrate that all of Sydney is reeling from this.
It's not dissimilar to when we had a madman drive through a crowd in a very crowded shopping area of Melbourne. If you weren't there and in the city on that day, you could easily imagine yourself to have been there. Such is sort of the throughput of people in these busy areas. What strikes me, I think, as tough at the moment, it's only 6 months ago that we saw those images of Sydney and the mob outside the Opera House go around the world in the aftermath of October 7. I mean, yet again, Sydney is in the international headlines for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, it is, and it's particularly shocking and upsetting for Sydney-siders who have been very proud of the heroism and bravery that was displayed and documented from Bondi Junction on that Saturday evening. So to see the horror unfold last night and then the reaction to it, that is just like a sort of a body blow after we were just sort of coming back to our senses with it. So I'm not surprised at all that Anthony Albanese felt it necessary to disclose that the National Security Committee has met, because this city is crying out for leadership and for a sense that those who are responsible for our safety are taking command.
What about the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns? I mean, he's not long in the job. What's been your view on how he's responded?
I think Chris Minns has actually done a really good job. I thought that he was the only one who stood up in the wake of the Opera House, debacle and shame. He was the one who stood up and actually was, I think, out of all the Labor figures, he was the one who was most succinct and had the greatest clarity about where our values lie. And I think that set the standard for the rest of his cabinet, which is very young, very green. And so they're fortunate. We are fortunate to have him there at this point. I thought he's done a good job. It was good that he came back from Japan. I don't think he really had a choice given the mood in the city. And I think at the moment he's striking the right balance.
What about your police commissioner? She's been under fire recently, and there were some pretty quick judgments today about the events in Fairfield last night, and criticism, fair enough, about the behaviour of some in the crowd. But I mean, there's no moral equivalence between an unruly crowd and a terrorist or an alleged terrorist still inside the church.
Oh, you're right. Look, absolutely. There's an act of terror. It was a febrile, it was an extremely dangerous environment last night. I think the cops did all right. I think it would have been incendiary if they were arresting people. I think that Karen Webb actually had her best performance this morning. I thought she was composed. She went through the issues and she was clear that this was an act of terror, an act of religious terror. This is Islamic terrorism. And I think that that is a relief to everyone who can see as plain as day that that's what happened here. So I think she probably got a few more runs on the board this morning.
All right, we'll leave it there. Ben English, thank you for your time. It's Ben English there, Chief Editor of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney. Still to come, I'll be joined by an expert in counter-terrorism for his take on what happens now and increasing concerns over lone wolf attacks. Plus, later on, new Credlin regular Chris Uhlmann, he'll join me to discuss how on earth we've reached this point in a society where we seem more divided than ever before. Welcome back. Still to come, plenty to get through, including my new regular guest, Chris Uhlmann, joining me for his take on what happens next in the Middle East. It's all on a knife's edge. Increasing signs of division here at home. Plus, Chris is a China expert, and there's some important considerations there I'll get across as well. But first, it's been a while since, as a country, we've had to wake up to authorities declaring a terror attack. But unfortunately today, we found ourselves back in that position. There is naturally a lot of anxiety surrounding this and what it means more broadly for our security. So joining me now for his insights, Dr. John Coyne from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who previously has worked in counter-terrorism with the Australian Federal Police. John, thank you for your time. We saw, of course, that ASIO's now declared last night's attack on the Bishop as a terror attack. That's in concert with the New South Wales Police. Now, with that declaration, my viewers will want to understand, John, what happens next.
Look, I think the number one thing to remember here is that the terrorism threat level has been reduced down to possible. That doesn't mean there is no terrorism threat. What that means is that ASIO and authorities do not have solid intelligence on specific plots. But it does mean, and because we've been at that higher threat level for a long time, people feel a degree of confidence. I think it is really of grave importance that we continue to understand that terrorism in Australia is an enduring problem and it will continue to be so.
The Bishop is very popular online, John. He's got something like 250,000 social media followers, and the service he was conducting last night is routinely live streamed. Now, those facts alone make me question whether he was targeted at the church precisely because his attack would immediately go live around the world. This has been the modus operandi, as you know, of Islamist attacks in the past. What are your thoughts here?
Look, we've always got to be careful at these early stages of investigation that it is up to law enforcement, it is up to the intelligence agencies to pull all this pitch together. But you have highlighted some significant facts here. Let's sort of look at it first, which is first off a lone wolf actor, which we've seen this pattern increasing over the last decade. Secondly, both ASIO and the AFP, as well as government, have told us that there is an increasing risk of radicalisation amongst young people in Australia. Third, the actual aim of terrorism is to make a big statement. It is to create fear, it is to create anxiety and have a disproportionate impact. And so, of course, anything that's live streamed like this presents as a great opportunity to bring fear to the community.
I know from my previous life as the PM's Chief of Staff and briefings that I had, the radicalisation, particularly of young people and increasingly online, can happen incredibly quick. Assailants may never be on a watch list or even known to police. that's reported to be the case in relation to this young man, at least in a terror suspect sense. Help people understand how this is really the prism now that our intelligence agencies, it's needle in a haystack stuff, have to work in.
Look, you know, from your time in government, you'll know this is the case, which is we've been very fortunate in this country. Some of it's luck, but for the most part, great policing work, great intelligence work has seen the disruption of multiple plots. That said, we are not exempt from tragedy, and we've seen that in the last 24 hours. We go back in time 10 or 15 years ago, when you're talking about cells and groups operating, their interactions mean, because they have to communicate, they have to meet, they have to organise, they have to plot, it means they leave a large footprint that can be followed. When it comes to lone wolf actors, and you again highlight a lot of this, where there's a very short period of time between when the fuse is lit, for want of a better term, so when they become radicalised, to when they actually take actions. Because of that, for law enforcement, it is incredibly difficult to track that down. Now, this reiterates what we've learnt over the years. Responding to terrorism requires assistance from the community. It requires assistance from families. It requires assistance from good policy. It requires assistance from law enforcement and from intelligence.
And I might add here too, I know personally of a number of cases where members of the Muslim community, often parents and relatives, alerted authorities. So please, I don't want people to think that Islamist and the Muslim community are necessarily interchangeable. Let's play this exchange, if I can, out of the Prime Minister's press conference, but this particular aspect from the ASIO Chief, Mike Burgess, and some questions. Have a listen.
I understand that, as you said, Director General, it's religiously motivated, but what can you tell us about the 16-year-old? We know that we're told that he's known to authorities. Do you understand he's been radicalised online?
I think at this stage we would best not actually share any more. There is a police investigation on foot, and those details are best kept in close hold until we actually work through the facts of the matter. What I did say, however, though, I support New South Wales Police in calling this a terrorist incident, and we believe it is religiously motivated.
John, given the climate in the community, I mean, can't authorities do more and get some of the Islamist hate-preaching sermons off the internet? I make the point at the top of the show. I mean, the internet is constitutionally the responsibility of the federal government alone. We know that a lot of these young people are radicalised online. Surely we get these sermons off the internet and we're at least halfway there to settling things down in the community.
Look, your time in government, you know as well as I do, it is incredibly difficult. And, you know, we've heard DG ASIO say this before. There is behaviour that's awful but lawful. It is not illegal to have extremist viewpoints. It is illegal to use violence to advance those extremist viewpoints. We do have freedom of speech in this country. Also, there are significant challenges in terms of taking down material across the board, across various platforms. We saw this play out after the Christchurch massacre, an incredibly difficult activity. And once we start down that role, and certainly the security agencies and law enforcement agencies are very clear about this, which is they don't want to be...
John, I've got to jump in there though.
They want to investigate and stop the attacks.
I hear you, but I mean, during the COVID pandemic, we had comments about ivermectin and vaccines taken down from the internet. I know in the case of the Voice debate, my discussion of the Uluru Statement, well, that was taken down from the internet for a number of days. Thankfully, lawyers at Sky News fought my case and we got it back up again. So if we can take down things like that, if you and I right now are having a discussion about what really is a woman in Australia these days, that might be taken down from the internet. If we can take all of that stuff down, surely we can take down hate speech from Islamist hate preachers in Australia.
Look, I'm not saying in many cases when it comes to hate speech itself, where it's defined, yes, those things can be taken down, but across the board in terms of starting to do that sort of censorship. And, you know, the points that you raised, lawyers re-raising and re-putting up material that you had done, that's the democracy, our democracy at work, and that freedom of speech. What I'm saying, though, is that, you know, the idea that we can apply censorship that way in the 21st century rapidly and across the whole of the internet, it's a very difficult proposition. Now, if you're asking me, would I like to see far less hate speech online? Absolutely. Would I like to see X and Elon Musk deal with the vile attacks on women online, incel behaviour, extremist behaviour? Absolutely.
All right, well, I think on that point we'll agree. Thank you, John Coyne. All right, are we letting religious hatreds take root and spread division in Australia to such a degree now that they'll almost be impossible to unravel? Do we really understand what's happening on the ground in some of our communities and big cities? Gallery veteran Chris Uhlmann after the break. Welcome back. Still to come, we'll get the latest out of the US as Donald Trump's criminal trial kicks off. But first, it was with great pleasure last week that we were able to announce the Press Gallery veteran Chris Uhlmann would join me every week for his insights, as well as working on a number of documentaries for Sky that no doubt we'll also discuss here in the future. Chris has had decades of experience as a journalist and in particular covering federal politics, 2 decades working at the ABC, political editor by the end in 2015, and then he moved across to Channel 9, filling the shoes of Laurie Oakes as chief political editor. Now, I'm pleased to say, though, he's a Credlin regular here on Sky News. Well, Chris, I tell you, what a week to start at Sky News. I mean, I want to go back to October 7 because it feels like ever since then, this sense that our social fabric is fraying. Feels like a community that was once so cohesive is now divided into a whole lot of tribes. I think it's a tinderbox, frankly, particularly in parts of Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, how do you feel about not just the events of the past, 48 to 72 hours, but how do you feel about things over recent months?
Well, across weeks, months and years, Peter, I've been worried about the tribalisation of Australia, and that's not just between cultures in our society, but between different political views where people apparently can't stand to be in the same room with each other, have a discussion, a civil discussion. I do wonder about what the proposition of Australia is now. What is it that we would all agree on? What are the values that we are prepared to fight and perhaps die for? I was in Ukraine last year, and I can tell you that that is a country which now, faced with that proposition, knows precisely what it stands for, precisely what it wants to fight for. It wants to fight for democracy. We face serious problems in the world, but for a long time I have worried that the biggest problem is us. If we don't know where we stand and what we stand for, then how can we stand against those people in the world and those countries in the world which would change the way that we want to live our lives? Because we'll miss democracy when it's gone. So I would say, what should we stand for? Well, parliamentary democracy, the rule of secular law, robust freedom of speech and equality of opportunity. They're all the sorts of things I think that we need to have a basic proposition, a values proposition for Australia, and politicians need to speak about it and defend it.
I have the same feeling that you had in Ukraine when I stand there at the dawn service on Anzac Day, and I wonder whether, current generations, people like me, would do what others have done in our uniform, under our flag, to deliver the freedoms that I think many of us just take for granted.
Yeah, just one small thing when you're at a cafe in Kyiv, and that is that you'll see the Ukrainian flag everywhere. Now, imagine if you walked into a cafe in Bondi and saw an Australian flag or several Australian flags on the wall. What do you think people would think about that cafe? What kind of mental decisions would they be making about the kind of people who ran that cafe? And the society that we're living in at the moment, it's become something of a level of shame to some people to be proud of the country that they live in. Now, that's not to say that we don't have serious problems and that we do not need to look back at our history and correct what went wrong with it. But that's the great thing about democracies. We have the capacity to learn and to change. I fear at the moment that the project of some in our society is to lift up every flagstone, every institution, and condemn it as a white, colonial, racist project that needs to be destroyed. And when that last flagstone is lifted up, where will we stand? What will we stand on? And what do we stand for?
All right, well, let's give me a judgment on the political class and how they've responded to things, because I have to say I've been angered since October 7 at the federal government, Prime Minister Penny Wong in particular, their attempts to find some sort of warped moral equivalence on Israel. And then we see out of the events last night in the Assyrian church, even today, it is a declared terror attack. But there was as much discussion today about the poor behaviour of a justifiably shocked and angry crowd outside as the actions of an individual hell-bent on an act of terrorism. We have got to reject this moral, or an attempt at moral equivalence, surely, Chris.
Yeah, look, an act of terrorism should always be called out. But then again, I agree with Chris Minns and the Police Commissioner in New South Wales that attacks on the police are not justified at any time. And those police were there doing their job to trying to keep that crowd and the people in that community safe. But it certainly was, so we're told by ASIO, an act of religiously motivated terrorism. Now, one thing that can be done to try and quell some of that is the preachers in this country can preach love and not hate. One of the things that's extraordinary about what we see with the three major religions in the world, the Jews, the Christians and the Muslims, is they all actually worship the same God. They all see Abraham as their founding father. They have more in common than not, and all of their creeds do talk about love and forgiveness. It would be good if they could concentrate a little bit more on those things and less on the things that divide them.
Well, you'll be pleased to know at the top I played a sermon from the bishop who was attacked last night, where he said all of those things about the Jewish faith, about Muslims and Palestinians. And then I juxtaposed it with hate speech on the internet from imams in Australia that we somehow do not have the guts in this country to order down from the internet, which squarely sits in the purview of the federal government. I mentioned at the top you're a China expert, or certainly a long-standing China observer. You'll be too modest to call yourself an expert, but enthusiast, there you go. It's been a while since you and I have spoken about China, but when we did a documentary 2 years ago, you warned presciently about China. Now, the government, yes, they'll say they've improved the economic relations, but I have to say, at what cost? Because it feels like we're back taking their money, but we're paying for it with our security and sovereignty. Do you think enough of Australians understand how grave things are in relation to China, Chris?
No, I don't think that they do, nor in the axis that we're seeing developing around the world. As I said, I was in Ukraine last year. The Russians are firing Iranian missiles at Ukraine and North Korean shells, and they can do that because they have money that's coming to them from China, which is bypassing sanctions to get that to Russia. And we're in a strategic competition at the moment. The government keeps talking about it. The government has recognised it. That's a competition for the way that the world will be run in the 21st century. And it's a competition between tyrannies and democracies. And at the moment, the tyrannies' voices are being very loud indeed at a time, as I say, when countries like Australia, the United States, Canada, the rest of the West seem to worry and wonder constantly about what it is they stand for and what it is they should be defending. Now, it's good that the Albanese government has settled relationships with China, but it's acting in the strategic space that was given to it by the Morrison government, which did the right thing in calling out the behaviour of China. Because if you aren't going to speak up at a time and say, where did this virus come from, when you have shut down your entire economy and your entire population is under threat, then when are you going to stand up for your country? So that was perfectly understandable. And the rage that was then meted out by China, the fact that we saw all of these sanctions against Australia, which were illegal. Now, apparently, we can sell our wine again. Great. But we've rebased this to zero. And I'll say one last thing on this. If the Australian Prime Minister knew when he met Xi Jinping that Xi Jinping's Navy had acted in an aggressive way towards Australian sailors and had exposed them to danger and did not mention it, then China has Australia exactly where China wants Australia.
Handsome boy, Chris Uhlmann. That's what it was. Thank you. Welcome to Credlin. I'm delighted to have you on the show. We'll see you next week. Now, that wasn't a mention of handsome boy to Chris Uhlmann. No, he's not bad on the eye, is he? It's about the Prime Minister, remember, and those comments in China. All right, after the break, Israel looks set to launch its retaliation on Iran despite the West urging them not to. But Plus, we'll go to the US for the latest on the first day of Trump's criminal trial. Welcome back. Let's bring in my panel for tonight. Joining me now for their take on big international stories, and they're everywhere. Sky News contributor Kosha Garda from the States and former Labor MP Michael Danby. Well, welcome to you both. We'll start with the tensions in the Middle East. Israel is urging the Australian government to designate Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terror group following the strike on Israel by Tehran. Now, surely this is a no-brainer, Michael. It was crazy that it was recently rejected by the Albanese government. On what grounds would they not list this mob?
Well, the bedwetters in the Department of Foreign Affairs don't want to upset people in Iran, but there's a wider issue now. The Iranians have shown their hand. It was recommended by a parliamentary committee. They were just about to do it, and strangely, when the two security chiefs were taken off cabinet, that recommendation was pulled. You have to ask why. Look, you've made the point earlier, Peter, that eventually real politics in foreign affairs catches up with all of these people playing student politics. And Penny Wong and Albo have to read the papers more. They're not hearing the truth from DFAT.
You're not wrong. Kosha, what do you make of a whole lot of Western countries, urging Israel now to have restraint after there's been 350-odd missiles launched at their country? President Biden, I'm interested in your take on where the US stands here, because they're the ones urging the Israelis just to put up and shut up.
Yes, I think there's three dynamics at play with this broader Western tendency right now to urge restraint, as you say, and particularly in the US. One is there really is this demographic shift that has happened over the past 30, 40 years, where the biggest stalwarts of the pro-Israel support are the aging baby boomers. And as they are more and more, aging out of the electorate and the leaders that represent them, you are actually seeing this tectonic plate shift, or this generational plate shift, I think, that undergirds the whole thing. The second is the consequences of immigration. And there's a lot of people that have been imported into these countries and formed a part of the electorate, especially for the left-leaning governments in place here in the US and Michigan, for example, that keeps coming up, that Biden and his policies are speaking to that faction in his voter base that is more Muslim and not that supportive of Israel. And so he's trying to speak to both audiences. And then I think the third is just a weaker leadership, where, we know that, for example, it's sort of affecting policy by payoff, where the Biden administration gave $6 billion to Iran in that hostage negotiation not too long ago. And then, of course, previously under the Obama administration, there was that, when Biden was, of course, vice president, there was that $1.4 billion with that infamous plane load of cash, which was about $500 million of that went out there. So I think all of those things funding the other side of the war, these demographic shifts and more, is why we're seeing this stance right now taken by Western governments.
Just quickly, Michael, I'm going to get your take on a whole round of litigation about election machines and election handling, campaigning in the States. And Kosha, a comment from you too on that Donald Trump criminal trial. But Michael first.
On the issue of election machines?
The litigation.
Well, America is, if you're an Australian, America is a sea of madness. They've got all of these election machines. They've got all different ways in different states of voting. I think a simple piece of paper with a pencil enforced all around Australia in one way leads us to having no question about how democracy works. If you have different systems, if you introduce a postal system that the Americans have never had before, and you've got all of these new immigrants, who's to say that they don't get a vote? Yeah. I just think the American system is made for disaster. I nonetheless think that democracy in the end wins out, and you're going to see a change of government. Biden is chaos. He has some good instincts, but he is chaos.
OK, I'd add we need some ID in Australia too. But Kosha, just quickly bring us home. This criminal trial, the criminal component's the most dangerous for Trump, isn't it?
It is. So this is one of the 4 cases that are criminal charges, and they carry jail time at the end of it. And this one, of course, that opened in New York City today is the only one so far that is going to trial before the election. It's a historic day in the country. Never before has a former president been charged criminally. And most people look at this and see it as really a show trial, even the people who don't like Trump, because it's a novel legal theory. They're taking a bookkeeping error and elevating it to a felony charge. I think the calculation is that some portion of the electorate will find him unelectable if he's a convicted felon, and that's what we're seeing play out politically.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Kosha. Thanks, Michael. I'll see you next week.
See you next
Here's
week.
Andrew Bolt.